In this video, I will be making this spiderweb wreath, which is not finished yet, but the upper half is pretty much what it's supposed to look like. Throughout the rest of October, I will be making fake candy spiders to go on it. So check back later if candy spiders are of interest. Why the candy theme? Well, when I was a kid, we made Christmas ornaments. I know, wrong holiday. By filling water balloons with air, wrapping them with string, and dipping them in sugar water. They were dipped and dried multiple times until the sugar crystallized on the string, hardening it and making it all frosty and sparkly. Then the balloon was popped and removed from the inside, leaving it hollow. I thought these ornaments were awesome and wanted to try making them in different shapes. Way back then, I had the idea to make a wreath out of the long balloons typically used for balloon animals, but never got around to trying it. Until last year, but we'll get to that in a moment. For this wreath, I'll be using spiderweb netting instead of string. I can't imagine wrapping a wreath in string and actually getting good results, let alone finishing the process before I die of old age, or boredom. And instead of the sugar, I'll be using resin and mica powder. I'll also be constructing the entire thing over an inflatable donut, for reasons. When I attempted this project last year, thinking that it would be a great way to hit the ground running with my new channel, I ended up running straight into a wall. Oh. After much popping and frustration, I managed to get a wreath that stayed in one piece long enough for me to wrap half of it in netting. And then I discovered that the balloons were slowly deflating and leaving the netting baggy. So I scrapped the project until I could find a better wreath mold. Enter the inflatable donut. I could have also gotten professional grade balloons, which would have had fewer problems and would have certainly been easier to pop and remove from the finished wreath, but I'd had quite enough of balloons. As for the challenge of removing the donut, we'll burn that bridge when we get to it. I wrapped it in plastic wrap because I was fairly certain that the resin would stick to the donut, making it downright impossible to remove. If it sticks to the plastic wrap, well, at least it's clear and very thin. I cut the wrap into narrow strips in order to smoothly and completely wrap the donut, and wrapped the strips around small glass jars to prevent it from sticking to itself and wadding up before I could get it where I wanted it to be. With the donut fully wrapped, and now a different color because the yellow one began slowly deflating and giving me flashbacks to last year, I was ready to start in on the netting. While this did go much better than before, it was still a long, tedious process and proved difficult to film. It's far easier to tell than show, but I'll do my best to match footage with my explanation. I wrapped the netting around the donut as snugly as I could without distorting it, and cut off anything that was sticking out because there was too much netting in that spot, overlapping, or restricting the netting from wrapping snugly. I used a blunt needle and thread to connect the cut edges, which I found worked best if I left a little gap, roughly the size of the shapes in the netting, which do vary in size quite a bit, so the gap didn't have to be precise. Although, in many places, I did allow the corners of two shapes to touch and tied them together there. I tried to mimic the look of the netting as much as possible with the thread, going back and forth multiple times over a gap, and then wrapping the thread around the grouped threads to combine them into one thicker one. I also wrapped the thread around a little as I traced over the strands in the netting to get from one point to another, which hid it pretty well. I trimmed off any pokey ends along the cut edges. It was much easier to create new connecting branches out of thread than it was to try and use the existing ones once they'd been cut. If a gap was too large to fill in with thread connections, I cut a patch of netting to mostly fill it in, and then connected it with the thread. When I finally finished wrapping the donut in netting, I added 3 lids from Pringles cans to the bottom. Never mind the stickers, those were just to cover a pokey spot on the lid. After all the time I spent on the netting, I was a little paranoid about puncturing the dratted thing. Anyway, I tied the lids to the wreath with ribbon, just so that it would be easy to tell apart from the netting, and the wreath was ready for resin. I filled the Pringles cans with rocks to create a sturdy base for the wreath that was high enough that I could apply resin on the bottom, but that I could also very easily add the wreath to, or remove the wreath from, just by popping the lids on or off of the cans. Then I mixed up a batch of resin, added a dash of white mica powder, and set to work applying the resin to the webby donut. It's important to wear the proper PPE when working with resin, and, if possible, work in a well-ventilated area. The proper PPE being a mask and gloves. But in my case, I also put on some plastic bag sleeves, because I didn't want resin on my arms, and I was going to be reaching under a big drippy donut. I set up in the garage, great for ventilation and keeping the whole mess away from my curious cat, but not so great when it comes to light. At least, not after the sun starts setting, which it was by the time I got going on the resin. I recommend starting earlier in the day, if possible, when tackling big messy projects that you can't stop in the middle of. I applied a second coat of resin the next night because the first one was not enough to solidify the netting, but the process was the same, so I didn't film it. Once all the resin was fully cured, I was able to pry off the Pringles lids, which had collected much more resin than I anticipated, and begin the donut extraction. I cut all the way through the donut, and with a great deal of poking and prodding, was able to collapse it and begin shifting it through the wreath. At this point, I was still trying to avoid making large holes in the back of the wreath, but I gave up on that idea pretty quickly. I was able to remove the donut without doing too much damage, though. With the donut gone, I was able to see just how much of a problem the plastic wrap turned out to be. It was really difficult to remove, and even after I got rid of it, the wreath still looked plasticky. The resin that pooled in the openings of the netting looked pretty much just like the plastic wrap, and it was not the look I was going for. So I started cutting it out of the holes. This was easy on the ones where the resin was thin, and somewhat more difficult where it was thicker. It took ages to finish less than half of it, but at this point I'd already sunk enough time, effort, and materials into this project that I wasn't about to give up on it. I dented the wreath in the process, but found that applying heat made it pop back to its original shape. I just had to be careful not to deform it again while it was still warm and pliable. Once I had enough of the holes cleared to show what the wreath was supposed to look like, I cut a large ring out of felt to stick inside the wreath to cover up the jagged gaping holes in the back, and the areas where the resin was far too thick to try removing. The felt liner also made the web design show up much better from the front, so it ended up being a good thing to add anyway. I loosely tacked it in place with some matching thread. I'll need to remove it again to finish clearing the holes, and took some semi-final shots of the wreath so that I could finish this already delayed video. In hindsight, I could have done a lot of things differently, such as using mold release on the plastic or even just on the donut. Maybe I could have used a penetrating resin that would actually soak into the netting so that it could be stiffened without the resin pooling between the threads. Or perhaps something other than resin. Starch, Mod Podge, or even the sugar water from the inspiration ornaments all those years ago. That's how it is when you dive into new projects with untested techniques. Sometimes it goes sideways. You can learn a lot from the process, though, and sometimes you can get it back on track. I'll keep chipping away at this thing later, but for now, I've got some candy spiders to make.